June the 28th, 1940. German aircraft screamed down on the harbour of St. Peter Port in the Channel Islands. Strafing the dockside, they kill 33 civilians. Chillingly, they then fire upon an ambulance racing to help the wounded before turning out to sea and attacking the local lifeboat. This was the Nazi version of shock and awe. When the German Air Force returned days later, 150 square miles of British territory were occupied without a shot being fired. The Channel Islands were the first and only British territory to fall to the incredible pace of Hitler's blitzkrieg. And so began the bizarre story of Hitler's island madness. Hitler's extraordinary obsession with the only British territory he captured was to turn the Channel Islands into the most fortified place on Earth. Because of that obsession, these tiny islands saw such towering figures as Mountbatten, Churchill, and Stalin arguing over their fate. But as the Battle of Britain raged in the skies over England, it became apparent to even the most fanatical Nazi that the blitzkrieg had been stopped. Hitler opened a second front in the east towards Russia. And in the west, attack gave way to defense. Today, as the birds soar above the seawalls, few visitors realize that they are actually flying above tank defenses built by slave laborers who toiled under the brutal yoke of the Third Reich. It nearly never happened. On July the 2nd, 1940, Churchill wrote to his personal chief of staff, suggesting a night raid upon the islands. Almost immediately, the newly formed commandos undertook their first operation. It was a fiasco. The Navy all but missed the island. Half the launches were left behind or lost. The enemy could not be found, and when the raiding party started to swim back to their escort, there were found to be some non-swimmers. They were left behind to face certain imprisonment. There is no question that the Führer was always worried that the British would like their islands back, if only for the propaganda value. Nor did he underestimate the propaganda value of German troops filmed cheerfully mingling with British citizens. Hitler was immensely proud of his only British conquest, and he was determined that this latest part of the Reich should not be recaptured. He argued that the islands had strategic importance and that they were his laboratory for Anglo-German relations. He issued a stream of orders for the defense of the islands. All beaches were to be mined. All open areas set with obstacles. At least 200 strongpoints were to be set up on both Guernsey and Jersey. Then in June 1941, German forces flooded eastwards across Europe to begin the assault on Russia, Operation Barbarossa. Bizarrely, in the midst of planning Barbarossa, the biggest invasion in history, Hitler took time out to worry about the Channel Islands. Not satisfied with progress there, he launched yet more orders and a crash building program was begun. But Allied sniping raids on the coast of Europe were increasingly successful. The protection of Fortress Europe became a priority. Hitler's response was to create the Atlantic Wall. At over 3,125 miles long, stretching from Norway to the Spanish borders, the vast range of structures and defenses, the immense volume of concrete, the sheer scale of the workforce, combined to make it unique amongst 20th century military defenses. As General Hans Speidel recorded in his memoirs, the Pas de Calais and the Channel Islands were to be made the mightiest fortresses in an 8-year plan. This was the will of Hitler. The Channel Islands became a unique point in this unique line. As German soldier Jack Jablonowski found when he was billeted there.
I found that Guernsey was one of the most beautiful islands I ever had seen. When I got back to Guernsey, more fortifications were built. I always wondered, look at all that cement was being used.
The idea of the fortifications was effectively to combine all of the resources available, so anti-aircraft guns, anti-tank guns, beach landing defences, artillery and anti-aircraft defence, and therefore control those through a series of bunkers to effectively make, as Hitler ordered, the Channel Islands impregnable.
Today, few people realise how far back the history of the island's fortification extends. The Germans, however, did. They left behind in Guernsey's royal court an extraordinary manuscript, the Festung Guernsey. It details everything the German forces learnt about the military history of the island and its previous fortifications, and how they set about using them for their own ends, no matter how old they were.
There are some little ramparts and ditches on promontories along the south coast which could be Neolithic in date. Basically, things get bigger and better as time goes on. So then through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, there are more fortifications developed. Where we're standing, Vale Castle was fortified for the first time probably around 800 or 700 BC, early in the Iron Age.
But the fortification of the islands really began when King John lost Normandy in 1204. Island leaders chose to pledge allegiance to the English sovereign, to the fury of the French. As the islands commanded the sea routes to those parts of southern France still held by the king, they suddenly assumed an immense strategic importance. The first French attack came a mere 10 years later, when a pirate called Eustace the Monk attempted to capture Guernsey. It was the start of centuries of invasion, threat, and fortification.
Most of the time they were defending themselves against the French. Just occasionally the French actually managed to take over small bits, noticeably Castle Cornet, for a few years in the 14th century.
When, in 1778, France declared allegiance with the American colonists in their struggle with the British, the islanders made fortunes attacking French shipping. The French weren't pleased. It was time to invest in some serious fortification, and over a dozen coastal towers were built to command likely invasion sites around the coast.
There were originally 15 loophole towers, of which I think it's now 12 are left. They were all built slightly before the true Martello towers, so they were built in the late 18th century. They could take a small number of men, with the loopholes obviously for musket fire.
By 1804, it was decided to build a further 3 fortifications, this time modelled on the Martello towers that were being built across the south coast of England. The islands had now become fortresses. All military planners look at the terrain with the same eye. The defensive positions, the high ground, the fields of fire, the killing fields. And the German forces in 1940? They saw Guernsey no differently to the local defenders before them.
So then you get a whole new wave of fortification, but basically on the same sites. Some of the smaller gun batteries around the coast, when they were in a useful position, a site where you got a particularly good view, they were refortified in the Second World War. They were used again.
Indeed, the German engineers paid a great compliment to the military engineers of earlier times, announcing that not only were the fortifications in the best possible strategic positions, but that they were so well built, they only needed the addition of a reinforced concrete roof to make them suitable for the needs of 20th century warfare.
Castle Corner is, I suppose, the sort of premier fortification on the island, and that is one example of a place where the Germans obviously felt they could make considerable use of it. They poured huge quantities of concrete into the citadel, into the higher part of the castle, for some very well protected bunkers in there. And around most of the gun batteries that are around the edge of the castle, there is concrete. They were refortified.
But could they stop Britain getting her islands back?
The story of endurance and sacrifice is integral to Poland's history. They've been bullied, bombed, betrayed, and what happened during World War II still has the power to shock and surprise. Through expert testimony, eyewitnesses and newly released archives, we reveal the Polish wartime heroes whose stories of bravery can...
We can get a unique insight into the fortifications, thanks to the German military's obsession for record-keeping and one particular document, Festung Guernsey. Many historians believe that the Festung was created for Hitler's birthday. It was certainly designed to reassure. Every battery commander was asked to report his operational capability, standing orders and battle plan. These records were then collated and presented to the commandant as Festung Guernsey. The documents have remained spread across the island archives for over 60 years. But now, reassembled and translated for the first time, they reveal the immense scale of the island's defenses. They are the key which unlocks the secrets of the fortifications. The beauty of the book and its carefully crafted pages obscures the deadly intent of the structures and the brutality of the regime that built them. That task was given to the organization Todt. Organization Todt was formed from the workforce which had been constructing the autobahns under the control of Fritz Todt. Initially a civilian agency, it went in a matter of months from organizing a workforce of volunteers to directing an enormous slave labor organization. Ben Swatu was one such slave laborer.
Back home, before I was sent out, because we came out of work and the Labour office signed us on to be transported to Normandy. I landed in Normandy with the train and had a boat waiting for us to go to Guernsey. Didn't know it existed.
This rare archive film shows forced labour contingents comprised of men from across Europe. Russians mingled with Spaniards, Poles with French, Czech with Belgians, Jews with political prisoners. There were 27 different nationalities represented during the occupation. It didn't much matter where you were from. This wasn't a good place to be.
They said that they were working for the Germans in their own country, and they were told that they was getting this lorry because they were going to work in another place. Instead of that, they were taken to the port, brought to Guernsey in the clothes that they were wearing, and no way of telling their people where they'd gone or what had happened to them. And of course, they lived under terrible conditions.
Organization taught. They did the work. And of course, we had nothing to do with them. But every time when they started something, we always wondered and asked each other, what's going up there now?
The men were dressed in the clothes in which they had been conscripted, and no new clothing was issued, so they were soon reduced to rags.
One day, Sunday morning, going to church, my brother and I reached the top of Brock Road, and there was this long line of shackled prisoners. They were absolutely living corpses walking down to the boat.
And I thought, so many guys, so many of these men had to work hard with the pick and the shovel. They have machines for that. But then I was explained, yeah, you have to move these machines from the mainland to get, so it was easier for them to get these men over here and make them work that way.
The slave labourers were brought in from their billets and were brought in huge numbers on open carriages, whatever the weather, and they were brought in on this railway and they were dropped off where construction was being made for the bunkers. We had 2 or 3 along Peril that these poor men had to work to build, and they were on very poor rations, and they were in an awful condition, really.
Their day consisted of heavy manual labor, 12 hours a day for 7 days a week, with a daily lunch break of around 15 minutes, and 1 Sunday afternoon off a month.
It didn't take them long to build it. They said it took them a few weeks and the whole bunker was finished. But they had so many men there, you know. And,
they had a number of foreign labourers. They imported from England. They were under the command of the organisation Tote. More as everybody knows, they built these bunkers, they built the seawall, they built underground hospital, you name it.
Arbitrary beatings were a daily experience, with sand-filled hosepipes being a favourite tool of many guards.
It occupied about 10,000 organisation Tote slaves, if you like, workers, which were very illy treated. Some of them, I believe, were even doctors, you know, and some of them were conscientious objectors.
Nobody would hate you if you did what they told you. If it wasn't pleasant, like digging great big trenches, the only way you could out of that is do the job. They won't do anything to you if you do the job you're told. If you didn't, you're in for hiding.
But the real violence was a combination of back-breaking work, wholly inadequate accommodation and sanitary conditions, and a deficient diet.
The food we got, you could live on, but not do the heavy work, really.
That diet consisted of half a litre of coffee substitute for breakfast, a half litre of watery cabbage soup for lunch, and soup again on the return to camp in the evening.
We had slave workers billeted quite near us, and I saw quite a lot of them. 1 or 2 of them used to come to my house, hoping that I could get them food, but unfortunately, I couldn't give them very much.
The malnutrition that resulted from this negligence led to men dying from eating poisonous berries as they tried to supplement their diet.
The foreign workers in Guernsey had a very, very rough time. And I think that's what frightened us children more than anything, because they had 2 or 3 camps that they used to pass in front of our house to go to work on the tunnels and the bunkers they were building. And they were a pitiful sight. Very, very pitiful.
Even in death, there was no dignity. The first thing that happened when one of the labourers died was that he was stripped naked by his workmates, desperate for anything they could get. Their death certificates recorded time and time again that they were possessed of no effects whatever. Some local men also worked for the OT. Although there were alternative non-military jobs, the OT paid double and presented a much better opportunity for pilfering and small acts of sabotage. One enterprising islander worked for 2 years driving officers between the construction sites. In August 1943, he escaped to England. The information he handed to British intelligence stunned them. As men and concrete poured into the Channel Islands, officers in the Nazi High Command began to refer to Hitler's Inselwahn, his island madness. The earthworks constructed during the early days of the occupation began to give way to more permanent fortifications. These massive concrete constructions followed the simple principles laid down for the entire Atlantic Wall. Every port was to be rendered inaccessible to the enemy. Defensive power should be concentrated as far forward as possible. All batteries were to be roofed with ferro cement. Everything was based on the principle that the final struggle would be fought by the infantry. Every possible technique was used to speed up construction.
The continuous pour method was effectively to have a hopper at one end, putting in the raw ingredients, the cement, the sand and the aggregate, and then mixing those and continuously mixing those and firing them down wooden chutes to pour as high as they could pour. And they could pour normally about 2 meters thick to about 10 feet in one continuous pour. To help the construction of the bunker, they would shutter the sides of the walls. You can see here the shuttering marks where the wood was laid up against the walls for when they were poured. And internally, for added strength, they had a metal frame inside to strengthen the bunker. It's far easier to build a wooden frame and put steel reinforcing in it and pour the concrete than it is to actually get people to lay blocks. It makes it an awful lot stronger as well from a construction point of view, and of course makes it watertight and everything else. So from a construction point of view, it's much easier. It's much cheaper as well because you haven't got the labour costs. Hitler passed the order saying that the construction of turning Guernsey into a fortress had to be completed within 14 months. So they had to construct an awful lot of bunkers in a very quick period of time.
Well, it was a place which I basically hated, because 4 walls of cement, just a table with the seer there and so forth, you know? And you would sit there and wait for a call or have to make a call, whatever came up. And our 8 hours were over, we almost were happy to get out of there. It was not, you know, you feel when you are in a bunker so close together to each other, you feel kind of isolated from the outside world. Yeah. We were always happy when we just left that bunker.
Square joints and edges focus stresses and weaken the structure. To counter this, the leading edges of the walls were rounded off. Internal walls were not rounded and were considerably thinner. However, even the simplest bunker conformed to an internal layout designed to thwart the enemy. Anyone entering a bunker would be required to make an immediate 90-degree turn into a small room. This acted as a gas lock before the main entrance to the interior. Attackers could not simply blow in the main door, but had to fight their way through a series of rooms and corridors, all sealed by armored doors that isolated the interior. The intention was that a bunker that had been penetrated by the enemy could continue to fight. Larger structures had a machine gun post covering the entrance, preventing an attacking force from reaching the door. In the event of capture, there was a narrow escape tunnel that led to a covered ladder at the rear of the bunker. These were sealed with a steel door and 2 brick partitions, which had to be demolished to allow escape.
All of the bunkers are constructed of a standard design. Normally the corners are radiused to deflect any falling shells from artillery or aerial bombardment. They would incorporate their own electricity, their own generators, their own air filtration systems. Normally you have at least one main entrance. In most of the larger bunkers you have two entrances. The doors inside were all constructed and recessed to make sure that they could withstand the blast. They were also built to be impervious to gas attack. Gas wasn't used during World War II, it was during World War I, and that was a great fear for most of the troops inside the bunkers. So they had to have the filtration systems to remove the gas and make sure that the bunkers could be overpressured to keep all the gas elements that might be used against them out.
So we only had one entrance. That is, these steps there, they are kept open. The other side, the bomb was dropped and it's closed up, and they never cleaned it up since. That was our room for the navigation. Here you can see all these cables, they are still there. Here was the exchange, the telephone exchange, which you could call any battery on the island.
Most of the fortifications in the Atlantic Wall are of similar design. However, the Channel Islands are the only place with these enormous observation towers. Normally built with only 2 observation slots, those in the Channel Islands had an average of 5 slots, reflecting the massive amount of artillery on the islands, as each one was dedicated to an individual battery's fire control.
Of course, the guns could be controlled by radar as well, but it's much better to be able to see your target. Then you can triangulate your fire. So one tower would not be used on its own. They would use 2 towers, and they would range find from those towers to the actual target, and then from that what they could do is work out the precise location. The German artillery was normally very accurate and very fast.
The pinnacle of this artillery madness was the Battery Mirrors in Guernsey. Ronald Major saw the construction of this huge battery and described it in his diary as the Israelites toiling in ancient Egypt under the taskmasters of Ramesses II, with the brown-shirted overseers controlling a workforce of some 2,000 excavating the pits. The whole valley swarmed with men, and from a distance they resembled ants working on their kingdom. The construction of the battery held up work all over the island, consuming 47,000 cubic meters of concrete, creating stores and quarters for the 72 men required for each gun.
Well, here we are in Mirrors gun site number 1. As you can see, it's quite overgrown these days. It's been left to the ravages of time, really. Originally, this site would have housed the 30.5 centimetre or 12-inch Russian guns, which were off a First World War Russian dreadnought. The vessel was scrapped before the Second World War, and the guns shipped to Norway as part of the scrap drive. Those guns, when the Germans overran Norway, were captured in harbour on a ship called the Nina, and they were destined to be installed on the Atlantic Wall. What ended up happening was there was a shortage of heavy artillery. When these 4 12-inch guns turned up, they decided to install them here on Guernsey. So it's part of a battery of 4 guns. The individual sites had a crew of about 68 men for the gun and 3 officers to oversee the gunnery, but actually the entire site, with all the electricity and all the ancillary, there was over 480 men just to run this one artillery battery. It was the heaviest artillery battery on the Channel Islands, and strategically important because it cut off the Bay of St Malo by effectively reducing the shipping lanes so that nobody could go in between the Channel Islands and France.
The guns of the Mirrors battery could fire a shell over 32 miles.
Big Bertha, as we used to call her, when she used to go off, the whole hotel used to shake. She was a massive gun.
But if you can imagine these sites, and the actual battery housed its own water, it had its own electricity, it had its own radar, it had its own flak protection, and inside every single gun position, it had its own telecommunications, it had its own heating, its own hot water, showers, ablution blocks, all the air handling conditions and everything else, so that should the battery come under gas attack, it could be just simply closed down and you could have the whole battery running just through the filters on the ventilation system running through.
Guernsey is only 24.5 square miles in total, but the Germans planted an extraordinary 72,000 mines in 115 minefields, and there was more. Much of the coastline featured mined underwater obstacles. On the cliffs, 518 improvised mines and over 1,000 roll bombs were used.
Generally, the minefields were placed in areas which were blind spots, which couldn't be effectively covered by artillery fire, and also internally large open areas. Landcrest Common was an example of an area which was laid with lots of anti-personnel mines on what are called Rommel's fingers, which effectively are large poles in the ground. They have a charge actually up a pole, which are connected by wires, so should airborne troops land, they would land on the wires, detonate the mines, and effectively you would decimate the landing army. And obviously the cliffs on the south coast, as they learnt from the commando raids, could easily be climbed and assaulted by normal troops. So of course there were lots of anti-personnel mines there. In total there was nearly 70,000 mines laid. The minefields were very well laid out so that the Germans could actually lift them up and move them, and they did that quite often. So some of the early mines are in the roads and in the footpaths and cliff paths. And later on in the war you find them actually positioned more strategically.
Nearly 10% of all the concrete for the Atlantic Wall was now in the Channel Islands. Over 500,000 tons of concrete was poured, 250,000 tons of rock excavated. Anti-tank walls lined the beaches, and gun emplacements rose above all the key sites. The scale of the fortifications meant that by early 1944, the Channel Islands had received 11 heavy batteries with 38 guns, while 600 miles of Normandy coastline had no more than 37 guns in total. Tactically, Guernsey was the most important island. As the HQ, it had the heavier military imprint. By 1942, there were over 15,000 soldiers, nearly one for every civilian.
The Germans had their exercises. They practiced in case there was an invasion. And we used to see them hidden in trees or in hedges, and they had all their uniforms on, their camouflage uniform, and they had bits of twigs and that in their headgear. And they obviously practiced with blanks, wooden tops bullets, and they left quite a lot behind. And we used to collect these, myself and my friends.
It was the most heavily garrisoned outpost of German-occupied Europe.
Well, the British came over quite often, and of course they'd come up the Russell between Herm and Bordeaux then, and all the guns would let fire from the castle and from up by the Vale Mill.
The Festung fire plan for St. Peter Port shows exactly how difficult it would have been for an invading British force to take the town.
It didn't bother us. They were just firing, and we just hoped to God they'd miss, you know. They shut down one of their own planes once, and they were all, you know, hooray, 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 and then it turned out it was one of their own they'd shot down. So that we thought was fun.
Within St. Peter Port, obviously you had an artillery blockade on the harbour itself. So within the harbour, you have a blocking battery of 75mm anti-tank guns which are installed in bunkers. And they are then supported by the reserve companies, which are the Harbour Defence Company. Above the town area, you've got 10cm guns as a flanking battery for the harbour defence. The 21cm Mauser batteries, there were 12 guns that were installed in the centre of Guernsey, and they had very high elevation, and they could lay down their fire on St. Peter Port should it come under attack. The infantry were there to support the harbour defences, but also to support any airborne attack.
The fire plan for Vazon Bay shows that the open beaches would not have been any easier.
Vazon, obviously, because of its very wide, open, sandy beaches, was protected by strong points. The main strong point, obviously, being Fort Hume, where they had the 10.5 guns to support the headland there. Those, in turn, were supported by 4.7 anti-tank guns. So, if you like, the 10.5 are intended to open up on any landing craft coming into the bay, and then once the troops or vehicles have landed onto the beach, then the 4.7 guns, which are effectively Czechoslovakian anti-tank guns, are used in either anti-personnel role, firing shrapnel, or firing direct target projectiles to take out any vehicles that were able to be landed on the beaches. There's also the minefields as well. Behind that, you've got machine guns, you've got flamethrowers. You have a support company as well, which are trundling round in self-propelled guns. They're supported in turn with 8cm mortar batteries, which were mobile and could be moved to any location. They had a fallback defence as well. It's a very flat, marshy area, predominantly. The Germans did flood that so that they could prevent airborne forces landing there. But on the high ridge behind, there was a whole defensive line put in place so that you could move the mortars and men either up from the beaches to a fallback position, or you could bring reserve companies up to support and lay down fire on the beach area. But certainly the West Coast was deemed to be probably the largest threat for any seaborne landing.
Gun positions were sited to allow fire to be directed in two directions and at the shore, to allow the beach to be enfiladed. Usually it was possible to establish a zone of crossfire with at least one more strong point. Despite a steady supply of intelligence about the scale of the fortifications, Mountbatten was still keen to recapture the islands and proposed Operation Constellation, which would have seen 5,000 troops invade Alderney alone. Amazingly, Stalin was a supporter of the Mountbatten plan, but only as the beginning of a second front in Europe. In August 1942, the Allies had launched a speculative raid at Dieppe on the French coast. 6,100 British, Canadian and American troops staged a one-day assault designed to draw German troops from the Eastern Front. It was a disaster. There were 4,000 Allied casualties, and almost 1,500 Canadians were taken prisoner. Perhaps mindful of the ill-fated Dieppe raid, wiser heads prevailed, and Operation Constellation was never put into action. But while Constellation was quietly dropped, another, much bigger, bolder plan was looming. By 1944, Guernsey was the most fortified place on Earth. But many German officers were unconvinced of the island's strategic value. As General Speidel recalled, no airfields were built, although these islands could only be important as aircraft carriers. But Hitler's island madness showed no signs of abating. On one occasion, the Führer flew into a rage, shouting, "I am the greatest builder of fortifications of all time. I built the West Wall. I built the Atlantic Wall." But while there began to be dissenting voices, only one man dared to challenge the Führer directly. Field Marshal Rommel was in charge of the Atlantic Wall project, and with resisting the invasion that he knew was only a matter of time. Although he no longer thought that the war could be won, he saw a strong Atlantic Wall as a valuable negotiating tool. Rommel's experience of defeat in Tunisia had shown him that mobility would be lost to Allied air superiority. He knew he needed a defending force in place to destroy the enemy before they could get off the beaches. As Allied air attacks stepped up on Calais, the most logical invasion site, there was also increased activity over Normandy. Rommel demanded that the bulk of the divisions in Brittany and the Channel Islands should be withdrawn and brought to the Normandy front. He was convinced that the beaches of Normandy were an obvious and under-defended landing site, but he never got the resources he wanted. He was quoted as saying that the last person to close Hitler's door had the decision. Finally, after rejecting a written demand from Rommel, Hitler forbade any further mention of the Channel Island garrison. The ordinary soldiers, under no illusions as to their fate, had nicknamed themselves the Canada Division, as they reckoned they were sure to go into Canadian prisoner-of-war camps. Then, on June the 6th, 1944, islanders woke to the sound of thousands of aircraft overhead.
That's when we saw all the planes towing the gliders, you know, across. And we, from my bedroom window, could see the flashes going on in France.
Initially euphoric at the prospect of liberation from 4 years of Nazi domination, the islanders soon learnt that the D of D-Day stood for disappointment, as the Allied forces swept past them and into mainland Europe. And the islanders endured the harshest winter of the entire occupation.
Well, we thought the war's nearly over. Nobody's going to bother now about a radio, so we all went to the house where the radio was to listen to the landings. And then, of course, we thought the war was going to be over, and it wasn't, so he had to hide his radio again. The next time we went was the end of the war.
Churchill, by now fully informed as to the extent of the island's fortifications, knew exactly how hard they would be to recapture and the massive loss of life that would occur. One member of Force 135, the group specifically charged with liberating the islands, was desperate to get into action, until he chanced upon a plan of the island's fortifications on his commanding officer's desk. He declared himself a lot less keen after that. Instead, Churchill resolved to leave the islands alone, secure in the knowledge that the 35,000 German soldiers there would play no part in the coming battles. The islands were, he said, the largest POW camp in Europe. The immense fortifications were never tested. Not one shot was fired. The garrison surrendered without striking a blow. They were sent to Canada, just as they had predicted. It may have been a bloodless battle, but the truth remains that at least 500 and perhaps many more lost their lives during the fortification of the islands. But why had the islands been so massively fortified? In reality, the scale of the fortifications far outweighed the strategic importance of the islands. Many believe that the Channel Islands were to have been a holiday destination for senior Nazis. A few have even suggested that they were to be offshore death camps for the cleansing of a conquered Britain. The more likely truth is that Hitler was obsessed with the only British territory he conquered. What is beyond doubt is that his Inselwahn, his island madness, made the Channel Islands the most fortified place on Earth, and wasted enough men and materials to create a chink in the Atlantic wall that helped to turn the tide of war.
Can you imagine all this material was put in these? Just to kill and get killed. Well, that is the fate of the soldier. Kill or get killed.